The lasbolt took Sergeant Carrow through the throat 17 seconds into our advance across the killing field, and I watched his body continue running for 3 more steps before it understood that it was dead. His boots kept churning through the mud and the ash and the carpet of bodies that had been the first wave. And then he folded, and I ran past him, and the screaming in my ears was my own voice, though I did not remember opening my mouth. This is what it feels like to die for the Imperium. The air tasted of copper and promethium and something sweeter beneath it all. Something that I would later learn was the smell of human fat burning in the fires that consumed the bodies we trampled. My lungs pulled at that air in ragged gasps, each breath a conscious decision, because the animal part of my brain had stopped believing that breath was necessary, had stopped believing that anything I did in these final moments could matter. The fortification loomed ahead, 300 meters of open ground still to cross, and the heavy bolters had found their rhythm now, their thunder so constant that it became a kind of silence, a roar so complete that individual sounds dissolved within it. I was already dead. We all were. The men who ran beside me were ghosts who had not yet learned to lie down. I saw Velen take a round through the chest and spin, his body pirouetting with an obscene grace before it crumpled. I saw the new conscript. I never learned his name. He had been with us for 6 days, simply come apart, his torso separating from his legs in a red mist that painted the man behind him. I saw, and I kept running, because running was all that remained, because the only direction that existed now was forward, because stopping meant dying, and running meant dying, and there was no third option that the Imperium had seen fit to provide. Suicide mission. The words had not been spoken in our briefing. Such words are never spoken, but we knew. 16 hours earlier, I had been alive in a way that I would never be again. I had been a man with a future, however uncertain, however bloody. I had been Guardsman Aldrin Soth of the Cadian 214th. Not a hero, not a coward, simply a man who had survived 4 years of war through luck and the deaths of better soldiers around me. I had learned to sleep in trenches filled with rainwater and the seepage of mass graves. I had learned to eat rations that tasted of nothing while surrounded by smells that would never leave my memory. I had learned to kill and to keep killing and to feel nothing while I did it, because feeling was a luxury that the Imperium did not issue alongside laser guns and flak armor. I had learned, in other words, to be useful. And it was my usefulness that condemned me. The briefing came at the 19th hour, ship time. We were assembled in the cargo bay of a transport whose name I never knew, one of the countless vessels that carried us from war to war like grain being shipped between starving worlds. There were 400 of us gathered beneath the flickering lumen globes, our breath fogging in air that the ship's ancient systems could not properly heat, our boots scraping against deck plates that had been worn smooth by generations of soldiers who had stood where we stood and received orders that sent them to their death. Colonel Varkan did not look at us when he spoke. I remember that clearly, the way his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above our heads, as if he were addressing the bulkhead rather than the men he was condemning. His voice carried the mechanical flatness of a man who had delivered such speeches before, who had learned to separate the words from their meaning, who had discovered that the only way to send men to die was to stop seeing them as men at all. The fortress at Calith's Ridge controls the northern approach, he said. Intelligence indicates it is held by approximately 800 enemy combatants with entrenched heavy weapons positions. Our orbital assets cannot neutralize it without unacceptable collateral damage to strategic infrastructure. Ground assault is the only viable option. Ground assault. The words hung in the air like poison gas, and every man in that cargo bay understood what they meant. We had all seen what fortified positions did to infantry advances. We had all walked through the aftermath of such assaults. The carpets of bodies, the screaming of the wounded who would not be retrieved, the way the earth itself seemed to weep blood for days afterward. Someone behind me whispered a prayer to the God Emperor. I heard the words, but could not make them out, and perhaps that was mercy. First wave will consist of elements from Third Company, the Colonel continued, his voice never changing, never acknowledging the death sentence he was pronouncing. Second wave from 5th and 7th. Reserve elements will advance upon confirmation of breach. Third Company, my company. First wave. I understood then, with a clarity that felt like ice forming in my chest, that I would not see another dawn. That the 4 years I had survived, the dozens of engagements, the countless moments when death had passed close enough to feel its breath upon my neck, all of it had been merely prelude to this. The Imperium had been saving me for something, and now the debt had come due. This was not punishment. This was not malice. This was arithmetic. The fortress needed to fall. Infantry could make it fall if enough infantry were fed into its guns. We were the ammunition that the Emperor's war machine required, and ammunition does not question its purpose, does not argue with the hand that loads it into the chamber, does not ask why it must be the one to fly toward the target and cease to exist upon impact. Beside me, Caro, who would be dead in 17 seconds once the assault began, stood with his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. He was a good sergeant. He had kept more of us alive than any other non-com in the regiment, and none of that mattered now, because survival was no longer a variable in the equation, because the Imperium had looked at Calith's Ridge and calculated how many bodies it would take to drown those guns, and we were the bodies it had chosen. The briefing ended. There were no questions. What would we have asked? We were given 6 hours to prepare. 6 hours to write letters that would never be sent, to clean weapons that would be pried from our dead fingers, to make whatever peace we could with the God Emperor and the fate he had chosen for us. Some men prayed, some men wept in the corners of the cargo bay where they thought no one could see them, though we all saw and no one spoke of it, because what was there to say? We were all weeping on the inside, those of us who had not yet learned to kill that part of ourselves, and the tears of the body were merely an overflow of what the soul could no longer contain. I did not weep, I did not pray. I sat on my cot and I cleaned my laser gun, running the oiled cloth along its barrel again and again until the metal gleamed in the dim light, and I thought about nothing at all, because thinking had become too dangerous, because if I allowed my mind to wander, it would find its way to places I could not afford to visit, to the faces of the dead who had been my friends, to the home I would never see again, to the simple and terrible truth that I was 26 years old and I would not live to see 27. The man on the cot beside mine was called Harl. He had been with the 214th longer than anyone except the colonel himself. 18 years of continuous service. A feat that bordered on the miraculous in a regiment that measured life expectancy in months rather than years. His face was a map of scars. His left eye a milky ruin from a green-skin blade that had come within a centimetre of killing him on some world whose name he had never learned. He was cleaning his own weapon, his movements slow and deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had already made his peace with what was coming. "First assault I ever saw," he said, not looking at me, his eye fixed on the action of his laser gun as he worked the cloth into its mechanisms. "We lost 400 men in 11 minutes. They told us afterward that we had achieved our objective. The enemy position had fallen. Victory, they called it. He paused, and something moved behind the ruin of his face, some memory surfacing from the depths where he had buried it. I was the only man from my squad who walked off that field. 9 men I had trained with, eaten with, slept beside for 6 months, gone in 11 minutes. And you know what I felt? I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Relief, he said, and the word fell between us like a stone dropped into still water. I felt relief that it was them and not me. That is what war makes of us. That is what the Imperium requires. Men who can watch their brothers die and feel only gratitude that they are still breathing. He set down his laser gun and looked at me then, his good eye finding mine in the dimness. You will feel it too, if you survive tomorrow. You will hate yourself for it, but you will feel it. I wanted to tell him that I would not survive tomorrow, that none of us would, that this was not an assault with acceptable casualties, but an execution dressed in the language of tactics and objectives. But the words would not come, because speaking them would make them real in a way that I was not yet ready to accept. And so I simply nodded and returned to cleaning my weapon, and Harl returned to his, and the silence between us became a kind of communion, 2 men sitting together in the shadow of their own deaths, and finding in that shared darkness something that might have been called comfort. The hours passed. I do not remember how. Time behaves strangely in the presence of mortality. It stretches and contracts, moments expanding into eternities, while hours collapse into heartbeats. And when the signal finally came, the harsh blare of the ship's klaxon announcing that we had entered the drop zone, I felt as though I had been sitting on that cot for years, and also as though I had only just closed my eyes. The cargo bay erupted into motion around me, men rising from their cots and gathering their equipment with the mechanical efficiency of soldiers who had done this 100 times before. And I rose with them, and my hands found my laser gun and my pack and my helmet without any conscious instruction from my brain, because my body had learned these movements so thoroughly that thought was no longer required. We filed into the drop ships in silence, 60 men per craft, packed into compartments that smelled of sweat and fear and the oil of freshly cleaned weapons. The benches were hard beneath us, the restraints tight across our chests, and when the doors sealed and the engines roared to life, I felt the vibration in my teeth, in my bones, in the hollow space behind my ribs where my heart was beating out a rhythm that it did not know would soon end. The man across from me was young, too young. His face still carried the softness of adolescence, cheeks that had never known a razor, eyes that had not yet learned to go dead, the way a veteran's eyes go dead when the killing starts. He could not have been more than 17, probably conscripted from some hive world where the choice was the guard or the gangs, and he was gripping his laser gun so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, and his lips were moving in a prayer that I could not hear over the scream of the engines. I wanted to tell him something. I wanted to offer some word of comfort, some piece of wisdom that would make what was coming easier to bear. But there were no such words. There was no comfort to be found in truth, and I had lost the capacity for lies somewhere in the trenches of my 3rd campaign. So I simply met his eyes and nodded once, a gesture that meant nothing and everything. And he nodded back, and that was all the communion we would ever share, because 3 minutes after the dropship's ramp came down, he would be dead, cut apart by heavy bolter fire, before he had taken 10 steps onto the killing field. And I would run past his body the way I ran past all the others, because stopping meant dying, and the Imperium had not yet given me permission to die. The descent was brutal. The ship bucked and shuddered as it pierced the atmosphere, anti-aircraft fire blooming around us in flowers of flame and shrapnel. And somewhere to our left, another dropship took a direct hit and came apart in a cascade of burning metal and burning men who tumbled through the sky like embers shaken from a dying fire. I watched them fall through the viewport, those distant figures wreathed in flame, and I understood that they were the lucky ones, that their war was already over, that they would not have to run across that field and feel their bodies come apart under the enemy's guns. The Imperium does not speak of luck. The Imperium speaks of duty, of sacrifice, of the glory that awaits those who give their lives in the Emperor's service. But we who serve know the truth that the propaganda cannot admit, that there is no glory in dying, only relief, only the ending of fear, only the silence that comes when the screaming finally stops. The men who burned in that dropship were not heroes. They were simply finished. Their account with the Imperium settled in full, and the rest of us were still in debt. We hit the ground hard. The impact slammed through my spine like a fist, and then the ramp was dropping, and the light of an alien sun was pouring into the compartment, and Sergeant Caro was screaming at us to move, move, move. And I was running. Before I knew, I had risen from my seat, my legs carrying me forward into the hell that awaited outside. The noise was the first thing, a wall of sound so immense that it ceased to be sound at all, and became instead a physical presence, a pressure against the skin, a weight upon the chest, lass fire and bolter fire and the screaming of men, and the deeper roar of explosions that sent columns of earth fountaining into the sky. I saw the fortress ahead, a brutal mass of ferrocrete and adamantine, bristling with gun emplacements that flashed and thundered as they poured death into our ranks. And I understood with terrible clarity that we were not soldiers anymore. We were not even men. We were a wave, a tide of flesh sent crashing against those walls in the hope that enough of us would survive to breach them. And the individual lives that made up that wave meant nothing at all to the officers who had sent us here. The first man fell before I had taken 20 steps, then the second, then the third. They dropped around me like wheat before a scythe, bodies crumpling and spinning and coming apart in sprays of red mist, and I kept running because there was nothing else to do, because the only direction was forward, because the men behind me would trample me if I stopped, and the guns ahead would kill me if I slowed, and the only path that remained was the narrow corridor between one death and another. I saw Harl go down, the man who had survived 18 years, who had walked through horrors that would have broken lesser men, who had made his peace with death so completely that he had become a kind of ghost even while still breathing. A lasbolt took him through the chest, and he stumbled, and for a moment I thought he might keep running, the way Caro would keep running after the shot that killed him. But then a second bolt found him, and a third, and he folded in on himself like a puppet whose strings had been cut, and I ran past him without slowing, because slowing meant dying, and I was not ready to die, not yet, not while my legs still carried me, and my lungs still drew breath. Somewhere in that chaos, I stopped being afraid. I do not know when it happened. I do not know how. But somewhere between the dropship and the 200-meter mark, the fear that had been coiled in my chest like a living thing simply released its grip and slithered away, and what remained in its absence was something colder, something harder, something that did not feel like courage but functioned in its place. I was going to die. I had accepted that, and in accepting it, I had been set free from the terror of it, liberated into a strange calm that allowed me to keep running, even as the men around me fell, even as the ground beneath my feet became a carpet of corpses, even as the fortress grew larger and larger in my vision, and the guns upon its walls continued their mechanical harvest. This is what the Imperium makes of us. This is what 10,000 years of endless war has taught humanity to become. Not heroes, not martyrs, simply men who have learned to function in the presence of certain death, to keep moving when every instinct screams for flight, to serve the machine of empire even as it grinds us into dust beneath its gears. I was 200 meters from the wall when the world turned white. The explosion lifted me off my feet and threw me through the air, and for a moment I was weightless, suspended in a silence so complete that I thought I had already died, that this was what death felt like. This absence of sound, this freedom from gravity, this strange peace that wrapped around me like a burial shroud. Then I hit the ground, and the pain came rushing back, and I understood that I was still alive, still breathing, still trapped in a body that the Imperium had not yet finished using. I lay in the mud and the blood and the scattered pieces of men who had been running beside me, and I stared up at a sky that was choked with smoke and fire, and I waited for the death that I knew was coming. It did not come. Not yet. I do not know how long I lay there. Time had become meaningless, a broken instrument that could no longer measure the distance between one moment and the next. The sky above me churned with smoke and the contrails of aircraft and the lazy drift of ash that fell like grey snow upon the killing field. My ears rang with a high, keening tone that drowned out all other sound, and when I tried to move, I discovered that my left arm had stopped obeying my commands, that it hung at my side like a piece of meat attached to my body by accident rather than design. I was not dead. This seemed impossible, a clerical error in the universe's accounting, but my heart continued to beat and my lungs continued to draw breath, and the pain that radiated from my shoulder confirmed that I remained among the living, at least for now. I rolled onto my side and then onto my stomach, and then I pushed myself up onto my knees with my one working arm, and I looked out across the field that I had just crossed, and I saw what the Imperium's mathematics had purchased. Bodies, hundreds of bodies, perhaps thousands, strewn across the churned earth like broken toys discarded by a careless child. Some lay still, their war finished, their accounts settled. Others moved, crawling through the mud, with the slow determination of men who had not yet accepted that they were already dead, dragging themselves toward a destination they would never reach. The sound returned slowly, filtering through the ringing in my ears. Screams and moans and the wet gurgling of men drowning in their own blood, a symphony of suffering that rose from that field like incense from a temple, dedicated to some god of pain. I had crossed 300 meters. I looked back and I counted the cost of those 300 meters in the currency of human lives, and I understood that this was what victory looked like to the lords of the Imperium, that this carpet of corpses was an acceptable price for the ground we had gained, that somewhere in an orbital command center, an officer was looking at a tactical display and marking our advance as progress rather than slaughter. The second wave was coming. I could see them emerging from the dropships that had landed behind us, fresh men pouring onto the field to replace the dead, their formations tight and their weapons ready, and their faces carrying the same expression of terrified determination that I had worn mere minutes ago. They ran toward us, toward the fortress, toward the guns that had already claimed so many, and I watched as the first of them began to fall, as the heavy bolters found their rhythm again and resumed their harvest, as the mathematics continued its terrible calculation. I should have stayed down. I should have played dead and waited for the battle to pass over me, waited for darkness or reinforcement or some miracle that might allow me to survive. but my body had been trained too well, conditioned through 4 years of war to respond to certain stimuli without conscious thought. And when I saw those men running toward me, when I saw them falling the way my comrades had fallen, something inside me moved without permission, and I found myself on my feet again, my laser gun clutched in my working hand, my legs carrying me forward toward the wall that I had been sent to breach. I do not know why I kept going. Duty, perhaps. Training. The simple momentum of a body that had forgotten how to do anything but advance. Or perhaps it was something darker. A need to see this through to its end, to witness the conclusion of the slaughter that had claimed so many, to understand what all this death had purchased before I added my own life to the toll. The wall was closer now. 100 meters, 80. The guns had shifted their attention to the second wave, and for a few precious seconds, I ran through a space that was almost quiet, almost peaceful, the thunder of the heavy bolters receding behind me as they found new targets among the fresh meat that the dropships had delivered. I was not alone. Others had survived the first wave, a scattered handful of men who had somehow passed through the storm of fire and emerged on the other side, and we converged as we ran, drawn together by instinct or desperation, or the simple need to not die alone. There were 9 of us. I counted as we ran. 9 survivors from a wave that had numbered over 400. 9 men still moving toward an objective that had already consumed the lives of their brothers. 9 souls who had been spared by chance or providence, or the simple indifference of a universe that did not care whether we lived or died. I recognized some of them. Voss, from 3rd Platoon, a quiet man who had once shown me pictures of his children, before an officer reminded him that such attachments were discouraged. Brennan, who had been a priest before the draft, took him, and who still whispered prayers under his breath when he thought no one was listening. Kell, whose face was a mask of blood from a wound somewhere above his hairline, running blind with his hands stretched out before him, like a man feeling his way through darkness. The others were strangers, men from other squads, other platoons, thrown together by the random cruelty of survival. We did not speak. There was nothing to say. We simply ran, a ragged band of the almost dead, closing the distance between ourselves and the wall that we had been ordered to breach. 60 meters. 50. The guns found us again. Voss went first, a bolt round taking him through the spine and folding him backward in a way that human bodies are not meant to fold. Then one of the strangers, then another. Their deaths marked only by the wet sounds of impact and the sudden absence of footsteps beside me. Brennan was praying aloud now, his voice rising above the thunder of the guns, words tumbling from his lips in a stream that mixed High Gothic with Low Gothic, with something that might have been his native tongue. A final desperate appeal to a god-emperor who seemed very far away from this field of slaughter. His prayer ended mid-syllable. I did not see what killed him. I only heard the sudden silence where his voice had been, and I kept running, because stopping meant dying, and I was not ready to die. Not yet, not while my legs still carried me and my lungs still drew breath. 40 meters, 30. I could see the wall now, truly see it. Not as a distant shape, but as a reality of ferrocrete and rust, and the dark mouths of gun emplacements that flashed with killing light. I could see the gate, a massive slab of adamantine that had been buckled by some earlier assault, bent inward just enough to create a gap, a wound in the fortress's hide that might admit a man if that man was desperate enough, if that man had nothing left to lose. We were desperate enough. We had nothing left to lose. There were 5 of us now. 5 from 400. I did not know the others' names. I did not ask. Names were for men with futures. men who expected to survive long enough for introductions to matter, and we had passed beyond such considerations, had entered a space where identity itself had become irrelevant, where we were no longer individuals but simply bodies in motion, ammunition expending itself against the target. 20 meters. The wall loomed above us, a cliff face of grey ferrocrete scarred by lash burns and impact craters, and the dark stains that might have been rust or might have been blood. The gap in the gate was ahead, a vertical wound perhaps half a meter wide, and I ran toward it with everything I had left, my vision narrowing until that gap was all I could see, all I could think about, the only thing in the universe that mattered. I was 3 meters from the wall when Kel, blind, bleeding Kel, who had somehow kept pace with us despite being unable to see, stumbled and fell. His hands found my ankle as he went down, not grasping, not clutching, simply brushing against me in a final accidental contact. And then a bolt round found him, and he came apart in a spray of red that painted the ferrocrete beside me, and I did not stop, could not stop, my momentum carrying me forward through the mist of what had been a man and into the gap that promised shelter or death or both. The darkness swallowed me. After the blinding chaos of the killing field, the interior of the fortress was a void, a space so dark that for a moment I thought I had been struck blind, that my eyes had simply given up their function in protest against everything they had been forced to witness. I pressed myself against the wall, and I gasped for breath, my lungs burning, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I waited for my vision to adjust, for the shapes of my surroundings to emerge from the blackness. I was not alone. The others had made it through. 3 of them. 3 strangers whose faces I could barely see in the dim light that filtered through the gap behind us. We stood in what might have been a corridor or a chamber, the architecture impossible to discern, and we breathed together in the darkness. 4 men who had survived the unsurvivable. 4 men who had passed through the storm and emerged on the other side. One of them laughed. It was not a sound of joy or relief, but something harder, something broken, a noise that escaped from his throat like steam venting from a ruptured pipe. The others did not join him. They simply stood, weapons ready, eyes straining against the darkness, waiting for whatever came next. I thought of the numbers, 400 men in the first wave. I did not know how many in the second or the third, or however many waves had followed while I crawled through the killing field and ran toward this wall. I did not know how many had died, so that 4 of us could stand in this corridor, breathing air that tasted of dust and cordite and the copper sweetness of blood. But I knew that the number was large, that the cost was terrible, that the Imperium had purchased this moment with a currency of lives that would never be repaid. The enemy would be coming. They would have seen us breach the wall, would have dispatched soldiers to deal with the handful of survivors who had somehow penetrated their defenses. We had seconds, perhaps, before they arrived. Seconds to decide what to do with the lives we had somehow retained, with the breath that still moved through our lungs, with the bodies that the Imperium had not yet finished using. I checked my laser gun. The power pack showed 18% charge remaining. 18%. I did not know how many shots that represented, did not know if it would be enough to matter, but I raised the weapon anyway, because raising it was what soldiers did, because 4 years of training had made the motion as automatic as breathing, because the only alternative was to stand empty-handed in the darkness and wait for death to find me. The man who had laughed was still laughing, the sound growing higher and thinner, sliding towards something that was not laughter at all, but its opposite, its shadow, a noise that spoke of minds pushed past their breaking point. One of the others, A thick-bodied man with sergeant's stripes barely visible on his blood-soaked uniform stepped forward and struck him across the face, a sharp crack of palm against cheek that cut through the darkness like a lasbolt. The laughter stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse. "Listen," the sergeant said, his voice low and rough. The voice of a man who had forgotten how to speak at normal volume after too many years of shouting over gunfire. "We're inside. That's more than anyone expected. More than they planned for." He paused, and I heard him checking his own weapon. The soft click of a power pack being seated. The whine of a charge cycling. The mission was to breach the wall and disrupt enemy operations. We've breached the wall. Now we disrupt. It was not a speech. It was not inspiration. It was simply a statement of fact. A reminder that we were still soldiers, that we still had orders, that the Imperium's claim on our lives had not yet been fully collected. We had been sent here to die. Yes, but we had been sent here to die doing something, achieving something. And the fact that we still breathed meant that the debt remained unpaid. I thought of Caro, dead in the first 17 seconds. I thought of Harl, dead after 18 years of survival. I thought of Voss and Brennan and Kell, and all the others whose names I had never learned, whose faces I would never forget, whose lives had been spent like coins to purchase this moment in this corridor. Their deaths would mean nothing if we stopped now. Their deaths would mean nothing if we crouched in this darkness and waited for the enemy to find us and finish what the killing field had started. The only way to give their sacrifice meaning, the only way to give any of this meaning, was to keep moving, keep fighting, keep advancing until the Imperium's mathematics were finally satisfied. The sergeant moved toward the corridor's end, where a faint light suggested an opening, a passage deeper into the fortress. The others followed. I followed. We were 4 men walking into darkness, 4 survivors of a slaughter that had claimed hundreds, 4 souls who had somehow slipped through the fingers of death and now moved toward a destiny that none of us could see. The light ahead grew brighter. The sounds of battle filtered through the walls. Distant gunfire, distant screams, the muffled thunder of explosions that shook dust from the ceiling above us. The fortress was still fighting, still resisting, still claiming lives in its defense. We would add ours to the toll. That was what we had been sent to do. I gripped my laser gun and I walked toward the light. And I did not look back at the gap in the wall where we had entered, at the killing field beyond where so many of my brothers lay broken and still, at the sky that I would never see again. Forward was the only direction that remained. Forward, into the fire. The corridor opened into a chamber that stank of death and promethium, and the sharp ozone tang of recently discharged energy weapons. Bodies lay scattered across the floor. Enemy soldiers in grey uniforms, their insignia unfamiliar to me, their faces frozen in expressions of surprise and pain. Someone had been here before us. Someone had carved a path through these defenders and moved on, leaving only corpses in their wake. The sergeant knelt beside one of the bodies and examined the wounds. Las burns, precise and clustered. The work of a marksman rather than the spray and pray desperation of men fighting for their lives. He said nothing, but I saw his jaw tighten, saw the calculation happening behind his eyes as he assessed what this meant. We were not the only ones who had breached the wall. Others had survived. Others had made it through the killing field and found their way inside. And they had done what we had been sent to do. They had begun to disrupt, to kill, to turn the fortress's own corridors into abattoirs. The thought should have brought comfort. Instead, it brought only a deeper awareness of how small we were how insignificant our survival in the face of the larger mathematics that governed this assault. We were 4 men in a fortress that might hold hundreds of enemy soldiers, 4 drops of blood in an ocean of slaughter, and whether we lived or died would change nothing about the outcome of this battle. The Imperium did not need us to survive. The Imperium needed us to cost the enemy something before we fell. We moved deeper into the fortress, following the trail of bodies that our unknown predecessors had left behind. The architecture pressed close around us. Low ceilings, narrow corridors, walls of bare ferrocrete that sweated moisture in the heat generated by the battle raging somewhere above us. I could feel the vibrations of that battle through the soles of my boots, could hear its muffled thunder like the heartbeat of some vast and dying beast. The fortress was being torn apart from without and within, its defenders caught between the hammer of the Imperial assault and the anvil of those who had penetrated its walls. The man who had laughed, who had been struck into silence by the sergeant's hand, walked beside me now. His eyes had gone flat and empty, the eyes of a man who had retreated somewhere deep inside himself and left only a shell to continue the motions of living. I did not know his name. I did not ask. I simply walked beside him and watched the corridor ahead and waited for the enemy to appear. They came without warning. The first bolt took the 4th member of our group through the skull, a round that entered above his left eye and exited through the back of his head in a spray of bone and brain matter that painted the wall behind him. He dropped without a sound, his body crumpling like a puppet whose strings had been cut. And then the corridor erupted in lass fire and we were fighting. We were killing. We were doing what we had been trained to do in the cramped and bloody spaces where men go to die. I do not remember the details. I remember flashes, the kick of my laser gun against my shoulder, the scream of a man I had shot through the chest, the sergeant moving past me with his combat knife in his hand because his weapon had run dry, the wet sound of that knife finding flesh again and again. I remember heat and noise and the copper taste of blood in my mouth, and I remember the moment when the firing stopped and I stood in a corridor carpeted with bodies, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely hold my weapon. 4 enemy soldiers lay dead. Our 4th man lay among them, his empty eyes staring at the ceiling, his war finally finished. We were 3 now, 3 from 400. The sergeant was wounded. A lass bolt had caught him across the ribs, burning a furrow through his flesh that wet blood and clear fluid. He pressed his hand against the wound and kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and we had not yet been given permission to die, because the Imperium's claim on our lives remained unpaid, and we were soldiers, and soldiers followed orders, even when those orders led only to graves. The man with the empty eyes had not fired his weapon. I realized this as we moved on, realized that he had simply stood in the corridor while the rest of us fought, his laser gun hanging at his side, his body present but his mind somewhere far away. The sergeant noticed too. He said nothing. What was there to say? We were all broken in our own ways, all carrying wounds that did not bleed, all stumbling toward deaths that we could feel approaching with every step. The corridor opened into a larger space, a command center perhaps, or a communications hub, its walls lined with equipment that flickered and sparked with damage from the battle that raged around us. Screens showed static and fragmentary images, glimpses of the killing field outside where bodies still lay in their thousands, glimpses of other corridors where other battles were being fought, glimpses of a war that had grown too large for any single mind to comprehend. And in the center of that room, surrounded by the bodies of his guards, stood a man in the uniform of an enemy officer. He was wounded. His left arm hung useless at his side, and blood had soaked through the fabric of his tunic, spreading in a dark stain across his chest. But he was alive, and he held a last pistol in his remaining hand. And when we entered the room, he raised that pistol and pointed it at the sergeant's head. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. I looked at this man, this enemy, this target, this obstacle to the completion of our mission, and I saw something that I had not expected to see. I saw exhaustion. I saw pain. I saw the same hollowed-out desperation that I felt in my own chest. The same understanding that death was coming and that nothing could prevent its arrival. He was not a monster. He was not the embodiment of whatever cause had set his world against the Imperium. He was simply a man like me. A man who had been caught up in forces far larger than himself and carried along by currents he could not control. "You have lost," the sergeant said. His voice was calm, almost gentle, the voice of a man who had moved past fear into something that lay beyond it. "The fortress is falling. Your men are dead or dying. Lower your weapon and we will grant you the Emperor's mercy." The officer laughed. It was not the broken laugh of the man beside me, but something harder, something bitter, a sound that carried within it the weight of everything he had lost and everything he was about to lose. "Mercy," he said, and the word fell from his lips like a stone dropped into still water. "You speak to me of mercy. You, who have thrown thousands of lives against our walls like they were nothing. You, whose masters sent men to die by the hundred so that a handful might breach our defenses. You, who serve an empire built on the bones of the faithful and watered with the blood of the innocent." He shook his head, and I saw something move behind his eyes, some final resolution crystallizing in the depths of his pain. "There is no mercy in this galaxy. There is only the mathematics of slaughter, and today the numbers have favored you." He raised his pistol. The sergeant was faster. The last bolt took the officer through the throat, and he fell backward against the console behind him, his body sliding down to join his guards on the floor. His eyes found mine as he died. Not the sergeant's, not the empty-eyed man's, but mine. And in that final moment, I saw something that I would carry with me for whatever time remained of my life. I saw recognition. I saw understanding. I saw a man who knew that he and I were the same, that we had both been consumed by the same machine, that we had both been reduced to ammunition in a war that neither of us had chosen. Then the light left his eyes, and he was gone, and I stood in a room full of corpses and felt nothing at all. The sergeant moved to the console, his fingers finding controls that still functioned, his eyes scanning readouts that meant nothing to me. "Communications array," he said, his voice tight with pain and something that might have been triumph. "Still operational. We can signal the fleet, call in coordinates for orbital strike." He looked at us, at me, at the empty-eyed man who had not fired a single shot. And I saw the mathematics happening behind his gaze, the calculation of what our lives were worth against the value of this objective. This is it. This is what they sent us to find. This is what 400 men died for. 400 men. The number hung in the air between us, vast and terrible and impossible to comprehend. 400 men who had woken that morning with breath in their lungs and blood in their veins, who had cleaned their weapons and written their letters and made their peace with the God Emperor, who had run across that killing field with the same desperate hope that I had carried, the hope that somehow they might be among the few who survived. 400 men who now lay broken and still beneath an alien sky, their eyes staring at nothing, their mouths filled with mud and blood and silence. And we three remained. We three, who had been spared by chance or providence or the simple indifference of a universe that did not care whether we lived or died. We three, who would carry the weight of those 400 deaths for whatever time remained to us, who would wake in the night with their faces swimming before our eyes, who would never again know the peace that comes from believing that life has meaning. The sergeant began to transmit. His voice was steady as he spoke into the communication array, reciting coordinates and tactical assessments and requests for fire support. The language of war flowing from his lips with the ease of long practice. I watched him, and I listened, and I felt the weight of what we had accomplished settling over me like a burial shroud. We had done it. We had completed the mission. We had breached the wall and penetrated the fortress, and found the communications array that would allow the Imperial fleet to rain fire upon our enemies. We had succeeded where 400 men had failed, not because we were better or braver or more skilled, but simply because we were the ones who had not died, the ones whose names had not appeared on death's manifest, the ones who had been passed over by the random cruelty that governed all such battles. The sergeant finished his transmission. He turned to us, and I saw the exhaustion in his face, the pain of his wound, the terrible weight of command that he had carried through the killing field and the corridors and the firefight that had claimed our fourth. He opened his mouth to speak. The explosion took him before the words could form. I did not see where it came from. I did not hear the warning that might have saved him. I only saw the flash of light and felt the pressure wave slam into my chest. And then I was on my back again, staring at a ceiling that had cracked and buckled from the blast. And the sergeant was gone, reduced to a smear of red across the console he had been standing beside. 3 had become 2. And then, as I turned my head and saw the empty-eyed man lying still beside me, his chest unmoving, his war finally ended by the same blast that had taken the sergeant, I understood that 2 had become 1. I was alone. I lay in that room full of corpses, and I stared at the ceiling, and I waited for death to find me, as it had found everyone else, as it had found 400 men on the killing field, and 3 men in the corridors, and 1 man at the console who had lived just long enough to complete the mission that had been purchased with so much blood. The ceiling groaned above me. Dust fell in streams from cracks that spread like veins across the ferrocrete. The fortress was dying, collapsing under the weight of the assault that had finally broken its defenses, and I was trapped inside its corpse, alone and wounded and too tired to move. I thought of Caro, dead in the first 17 seconds. I thought of Harl, who had told me about relief. I thought of the enemy officer, whose eyes had found mine in the moment of his death. I thought of all the men whose names I had never learned, whose faces I would never forget, whose lives had been spent like coins to purchase this moment of victory that tasted like ashes in my mouth. The Imperium had won. The fortress would fall. The mission was complete. And I lay in the darkness, surrounded by the dead. And I understood at last what Harl had tried to tell me in those final hours before the drop. I felt relief, not joy, not triumph, not satisfaction at a duty fulfilled or a mission accomplished. Simply relief. The same relief that Harl had described. The relief of a man who has watched his brothers die and feels only gratitude that he is still breathing. I was alive, and they were dead, and I was grateful for that. And I hated myself for that gratitude, and I knew that I would carry that hatred with me for whatever remained of my life. This is what the Imperium makes of us. This is what we become in service to the Golden Throne. Not heroes, not martyrs, simply survivors, broken and hollow, carrying the weight of the dead and the shame of our own continued existence. The ceiling groaned again. I closed my eyes. I waited for the end. The end did not come. I learned later that the orbital strike had been precise, surgical in a way that Imperial bombardments rarely are. The communications array had given the fleet targeting data accurate to within meters, and they had used it well, burning the fortress's defensive positions while leaving the core structure intact. I learned that the second wave had breached the walls in 17 different locations, that the third wave had secured the perimeter, that by the time the sun set on that killing field, the fortress at Calith's Ridge had fallen, and the northern approach lay open for the Imperial advance. I learned that I was the only survivor of the first wave. They found me 3 hours after the final bombardment, buried under rubble that had somehow formed a pocket around my body rather than crushing it. The Medicae who pulled me free told me that it was a miracle, that the God Emperor must have been watching over me, that I had been spared for some greater purpose. I did not argue with him. I did not have the strength. 417 men had crossed that killing field in the first wave. 417 men had run through the thunder of the heavy bolters and the rain of fire that fell from the fortress walls. And I alone had walked away, carried on a stretcher through the carpet of bodies that had been my brothers, my comrades, my fellow ammunition in the Emperor's eternal war. I spent 6 weeks in a Medici station, healing from wounds that the chirurgeons assured me were minor. My arm functions now, though it aches when the weather turns cold. The scars on my chest have faded to pale lines that I trace sometimes in the darkness before sleep, reminders of a debt that can never be repaid. They gave me a medal. They called me a hero. They told me that the sacrifice of the 214th had been instrumental in the campaign's success, that the fortress's fall had opened the path to victory, that the men who died on that field had given their lives for something that mattered. I did not argue with them either. I returned to service. There was no other path. The Imperium does not release its soldiers simply because they have survived one slaughter. There would be other battles, other killing fields, other walls to breach with bodies and blood. I was ammunition that had not yet been expended, and the war machine had further use for me. But I am different now. I carry them with me, Caro and Harl and Voss and Brennan and Kell and the sergeant whose name I never learn, and the empty-eyed man and all the others, the 400 faces that swim before my eyes when I close them, the 400 voices that whisper in the silence between battles. They are part of me now, woven into whatever remains of my soul, and I will carry them until the day when my own name is added to the manifest of the dead. I do not know why I survived. I do not know what purpose my continued existence serves. I only know that I am still here, still breathing, still walking forward into whatever darkness awaits, because forward is the only direction the Imperium allows. There are fates worse than death. I know this now. I am living one of them.